Hello and good morning, everybody. How you doing? We're going to have a really fun webinar today. This is Jeremiah. Welcome. And boy, I got a few housekeeping things for you. We got such a great crowd here assembled, so get ready for a lot of fun. It was a couple of months ago, Paul approached us and said, he was interested in doing something with one of these little tablets, these little drawing tablets. And so we're like, that looks kind of fun. We got it and playing with it. Next thing you know, we're like, we got to build a webinar out of it. And then, as I hope you've heard, we decided even better, how about we raffle one of these tablets off at the end of the webinar to one of you lucky attendees. That'd just be kind of a neat thing to add to our webinars. So if you haven't heard, that is going to be happening. So we'll be punching in all of your names into a very high-tech hat and pulling one of the names out of that hat. So that'll be happening at the end of the webinar. To get to the end of the webinar, though, a couple quick housekeeping items. At the top of your screen, there's a view options thing. And just so you know where that is, I like to click that so that I can exit full screen mode. Just if I need to get to something on my computer. So just knowing where that is. But the other one at the bottom of your screen is a Q&A button. I definitely recommend you go ahead and click that even right now, just to kind of get it up and ready, to make it easier for you to type in questions. But note that you're also going to be able to see the answered questions that other people have asked. So it's a really good companion to watching this webinar. And I'm also going to mention we are recording this, so this will be available on the website later today. So you will be able to watch this again. So that is enough of all of my intro. I'm going to get this handed over to Paul to take it away.
All right, thanks, Jer. And good morning, everybody. Like Jer said, you'll want to stick around to the end of this one for our raffle. You get to win this really cool tablet that I've been working with for about a month and a half or so. And I've just been having a lot of fun with it. This is me. My name is Paul. I'm going to be showing you some techniques in painting today using this tablet. And here's our outline of the day. I'm going to give a little introduction of the tools that I'm using, and then I'll go through briefly my initial setup and the steps I took to get to where we are starting. Then we're going to go ahead and paint in Photoshop, and there's a lot to cover, so I'm going to try to go pretty fast while describing everything, and then hopefully still have a few minutes at the end for questions, and then of course our raffle at the very end. So to start things off, I am using this very affordable drawing tablet. Certainly there are a wide range of different drawing tablets available for these purposes, and I did quite a bit of research to find one that wasn't several $1,000s but then also was pretty reliable and did a lot of the functions that I was looking for. So I came across this one, got some pretty good reviews, we ordered it, and I'm pretty happy with it. I'm definitely going to continue to use it for various designs and things of that nature. So this is what I'm using. But like I said, if you have your own tablet, if you're going with Wacom or any of those other either higher end or different tablets, they kind of all have a lot of the same functionalities with what they can do. This one does have a display screen, so I can actually see what I'm looking at as I'm drawing on it. So that's a plus to that. And so with this tablet and with a lot of these tablets, they have these various functionalities with them. They have a series of buttons on the side. And this one particularly has 10 different buttons that are all customizable. And it has its own software that comes with the tablet that allows you to customize what these buttons do. And so what I've done is I've set a couple of them up for my own liking. Like I switched this button to X so that I can swap my foreground and background colors. Starting at the top, I have a quick button for my brush tool. And then I also have next to that the button that makes the brush tool larger, and then also to make my brush tool smaller. And then of course I have the ability to zoom in and out on the fly. And then I assigned space bar to that button so I can pan around real easily, X so I can swap my colors, and so I'll be swapping between my foreground and background color constantly. And then the eraser tool is also a good one to have just right there, so I'm not going over to my keyboard or clicking on the toolbar itself. And then finally I have Control Z or Command Z for undo. So those are the buttons that I've set up. Certainly you can set up your own to how you see fit and what your workflow is. And so using this type of tablet has a few benefits over, say, using a mouse. One, and probably the most obvious one, is the being able to sort of draw as you would naturally and have that translate digitally on screen. So you can use any kind of skill you have in drawing or writing and have that translate digitally, which is just something you can't really achieve with a mouse in the same respect. And then also, we have these different pressure sensitivity settings. So with no pressure sensitivity settings on, I can draw a straight line, and the brush width is going to be consistent the whole time, but I can also turn on my brush size pressure setting there. So if I press lightly, I get a thin line. If I press harder, I get a, a thicker line. And then also you can control your opacity of your brush with the pressure, and also combine these two settings so that you have a opacity setting and a width setting with the pressure, which gives you kind of a really nice kind of watercolor effect there. And also smoothing plays a pretty big factor in what we'll be doing. With zero smoothing on, the brush follows your hand movements precisely. Whereas if you have smoothing all the way up, the brush is actually going to lag a little behind your pen and your movement. And so if you have this kind of a shaky hand, it's going to kind of correct some of the shakiness that you have with it. Or if you're trying to do very precise straight lines, turning the smoothing up is going to help you achieve those lines instead of following exactly how your hand moves. So before we get started in Photoshop, here's what I've done to get to this point. I created a simple landscape plan in Land Effects, and then I plotted the different elements of the landscape on different PDF documents, and I combined those documents into Photoshop and organized those different layers into layer groups. So right off the bat, we're going to have a good sense of organization, which is key. And then I've also created some custom swatches for my color palette. And so if you want some information on those steps, I cover those steps in this webinar that I did a while back. It was the first Photoshop webinar that I did. It really goes into detail on how you can take your CAD drawing and export it into different layers and bring it into Photoshop. So you have this nice organization when coloring items in Photoshop. So check that out for more details on that. Here are the different layers that I've exported from CAD as PDFs. Starting at the top, we got trees, down to shrubs. I got my boulders on a separate layer, side amenities, ground covers, pavement, and then I also have some line work for the ground. Here are my trees. I didn't color them because it's not necessary for what we're doing today. We got our shrubs, boulders, side amenities, including structures, fountains, furnishings, even playground equipment. And then for ground covers, instead of exporting just the patterns, I did solid hatches. And the reason I did that is so that I can easily distinguish between the different types of ground covers and make my quick selections of each type very quickly. So it's going to make my job a lot easier when making these selections that I'll be doing very shortly. And I did the same thing with some of the pavement. Just being able to quickly grab these with the quick selection is going to be key to what we're doing. Because I exported those hatches as solids, I didn't have the line work with it, so I also exported just a PDF with my ground plane line work. And then finally, for the pavement items, I turned those solid hatches into patterns and then just exported the pattern so that I can basically overlay these on top of the color and have that pattern there. And so by the end of the webinar, we're going to have the skills to be able to create this kind of hand-rendered look. Now, my initial goal was to create this all within the hour time slot, but after a couple of tries, it's impossible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take basically an element that has a different kind of style to it for each of these different layers, and I'm going to demonstrate how I achieve that look, and then I'm going to switch files to jump ahead so that we can quickly get through this, and I can cover everything that you need to know to achieve this drawing. Now, if you check in chat, I sent out a link to some files. The painting tutorial PSD is the Photoshop file that I am starting with. And then the CCLIBS file is a library of colors that I've created for this plan. So you don't have to go and figure out all your color palettes if you want to use the colors that I'm using. So without further ado, let's go into Photoshop. And it was open. Okay, so here we are. There's the file that I have sent over in that tutorial packet. Something I noticed after I made that file is that the shrubs is out of order. So let's just right away fix some of the order of the layer groups. But what we have is we have all our PDFs on layers in separate layer folders. And if you are trying to use my color palette, what you'll want to do is open your libraries here. And if you don't have this open, go over to Window and check the libraries box. And to load these, you'll just want to head to the hamburger drop-down menu and click on Import Library. From there, you'll find that file and then load it, and then you should have these landscape colors. And I've kind of organized these, and they're kind of based on sort of the Prismacolor naming convention, but I wasn't very strict on them. It's just kind of colors I liked, and I made up a lot of the names myself. So there's that. All right, so let's get started with the painting. And what I like to do when I'm working in landscape plans is start from the ground up. So if you have this order, basically we can start with the layers on the bottom and kind of move our way up as we go through. And to make this easier, let's just right away hide all of the layer folders besides pavement. And I'm going to show how to achieve sort of a watercolor look for this pavement here. So let's zoom in, make our lives a little easier here. And I'm going to pick up my pen and move over to my tablet. So what I want to do is I want to isolate this gray area, and it already has a color, so I don't need to make a base. I will be making bases for a lot of my other elements, but what I want to do is just grab my magic wand tool here, and with contiguous selected, I think the tolerance is fine, just select this area. So now we are confined to working just in this area that I want to be working with. And then I'll create a new layer, and I'm just going to call it concrete texture. Because there's already base color that I'll be going off of, I'm basically just going to be adding some color to add some of that texture that makes it a little more pleasing to the eye. So I'm going to start with I'm actually going to go with warm grays here. And I just want to add kind of a darker paint around the edge, and it kind of fades into lighter as it gets toward the middle. So I'm going to start with my darker warm gray, and I'm going to hit X to switch my foreground and background color, and also switch to a light gray. That way I can just switch these up on the fly. And now I'm going to use one of my favorite brushes here. I'm only going to be using a few brushes and showing you what they do because they work for me. Definitely recommend that you go through and just experiment with all these different brushes. It's a lot of fun. They all have different kind of pressure sensitivity settings. But I'm gonna go down to salty watercolor, which I like for these larger areas. And I'm gonna drop the opacity to, let's say, about 60%. And make my brush a bit bigger. And with the darker gray, I'm just gonna start painting around the edge here. Oh, maybe I should use the brush and not the eraser tool. Here we go. Salty watercolor. Make that brush size bigger. Just kind of starting at the edge. I'm lightly pressing down. This brush particularly, if you press too hard, it doesn't give this kind of nice effect there. And I'm just going to darken up the edges there, and then switch to my lighter color and go from the middle outwards in just these kind of light circular motions. And now there's a lot of contrast between these two elements, so I'm actually going to drop the opacity down, which I should have done in the first place. But let's just go down to 50% and kind of paint along these edges. And what we're doing is we're blending these two grays here. Maybe drop the opacity just a little more. And I'm just very, very lightly pressing down and blending these two. So I just want kind of a smooth blend between the two colors. Switching back to my dark. That. And then lightly pressing and moving quickly. Something that I like to stress about this, since we're going for that hand-colored look, what makes it look like it was drawn organically is that sort of imperfection. So I'm not going to be very meticulous about making this a perfect circle. I just want to achieve that kind of that hand look. So the actually striving for imperfection in this is what works for this style. And I'd say that's good. So we have our concrete there. And then I would go on and start painting these other areas in the same manner. But because of time, I don't have that luxury at the moment. So let's move on to adding the hatch pattern and what I like to do with the hatches. Now the hatches layer is in the lines folder. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna select that. And what I wanna do is since they're just kind of like these perfect lines, I kind of add some intrigue to it. I wanna make the each square, say in these concrete pavers, is gonna kind of fade at the edge, is gonna be darker than in the middle. And how I do that is I start by making a copy of the hatches layer. And with this copy, I'll go to Edit and add a stroke to that. And I found that for this example, 5 pixels of black on the outside works well. Now we have these bold lines on the outside of our hatch pattern here. And so we kind of want to blend it in so it doesn't look like it does currently. And to do that, just head up to Filter, drop down to the Gaussian blur. And actually 4 pixels is what I want. So now we blurred those. It's a little softer, but it's still way too intense for what we want. So then I drop the layer blending mode to overlay. And then drop the opacity down to about 50%. Maybe a little more. So now if we zoom in, you can see that there's a lighter value in the middle of these squares and it gets darker towards the edges, which is kind of a nice effect. And very quickly done. Also what I'll do is I'll drop the actual hatches layer opacity down to about 50% as well. So that's the effect that I like for these hatch patterns. It's quick to do that. And it looks a lot better than it did before, where it was just a flat pattern. And then next, let's do our walkway. We have this, say, decomposed granite walkway that goes all the way around the site. I'm going to be working on the lines layer again because I didn't export that out. I didn't have a fill for that, but I do have a solid area or a closed area for my entire walkway system. So if I select my lines layer and my magic wand tool, I can select the area where my walkway is. And for this one, I'm going to go down to my pavement area again, and I'm going to call this walkway base. So with this, I'm going to create a base in one color and then create a new layer on top of that and add the texture. So for this, I want to use the, let's see, what color? Dark sand is what I used for this. So click on dark sand. And while I'm here, I'm just going to click on light sand as well, because that's what I'm going to use to add that texture. So now take out your paint bucket tool, and on the base, drop your dark sand, and I'll create a new layer and call it walkway texture. And now switch to your light sand. And just very quickly kind of fill in sort of the middle here. Sort of like what we did with this, where we want the darker edges and the lighter middle. And I'm going to use, let's just use this brush again. I like this one. Up the opacity to probably about 50%. And just draw along it. You're going to get this kind of, this neat texture with it. Keep going over it. And make sure your brush size is small enough to fit in the middle of this path. And then you're just going to kind of work it so that you get this nice middle area of light sand. And notice I'm not taking too much time to make perfect strokes for this, because I'm kind of going for that, I don't want to say sloppy, but that hand-rendered look, the kind of organic look here. And if you notice you're going too far and you've covered that edge, just go ahead and switch back to your dark sand and kind of just take your brush and place it just on the edge and kind of go over it a little bit more. And I'm just very lightly pressing down on this. And so that's what I did for this walkway. Let's move on so that we can cover everything in time. But obviously you would continue this process all the way down for the entire walkway. And then Command D to deselect and see what you're working with. Okay, so you continue this process to finish the rest of your pavement areas. And if you were to do that, you would then move on to the ground cover areas, as we are here. So what I want to do now is this, say it's a turf. I want to add that style that looks kind of like watercolor and marker, with the fat tipped markers where it has the neat lines going across. Like I always really like that kind of look to hand rendered drawings. So I want to achieve that look here. And so I'm just going to do these two areas as an example of how I would achieve that. So let's go to our ground covers layer. And once again, Magic Wand tool. And here's the benefit of having all of your ground covers that are the same as solid hatches, is I can simply click on one of these hatches, turn off contiguous, and maybe adjust your tolerance, and click on it, and it's going to grab all of these of the same color on that layer. So now I'm very easily just working with this particular type of a grass. It's a carex grass there. And so I'm going to create a new layer. And I like this color already. So I'm just going to work off of this color as the base. And I'm going to switch to a darker green, not too dark, say maybe the apple green. And then we're going to use a brush that is probably my second favorite brush in Photoshop, which is the round watercolor. And I'm going to change the opacity down to 33% or thereabouts. And also the size, I found 40 works pretty well for this. And also I'm going to make sure my smoothing is up pretty high. Reason being is because I'm going to be making a lot of straight lines and I want them to be straight. And the smoothing is going to help with that process. And so what's important for this is that I make my lines and that they are all parallel. Sometimes you start hatching or making these lines and then you get up here and you're making lines that are like that and your angle is changed. And unless you do that purposely and you have a very smooth angle change, it's not it's not a great look. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to keep my lines parallel. And so what I do is just before I start really coloring it, I figure out what angle I want to make my lines, and I just very quickly make some parallel lines as reference as I go up. Like that. And I'm just going to do these two areas. And then once we have our sort of reference lines to help me stay parallel, I'm going to start by pressing hard off of the selection. And as I move in, I'm going to let up the pressure so that by the time I get to the other side, I have basically lifted the pen off of the tablet. And so I'm just going to kind of do this over and over and over again. And as I get to these edges and these corners, I want to keep them kind of dark. So once again, we're getting that effect where the outer edges are darker than what is in the middle. And so I'm just going to quickly do this here. Notice that not all lines are going the same distance. I think that kind of helps with this style. And as I go in, I'm just going to kind of fill that in. And it's important to note that with these brushes, I don't have the opacity pressure on. So when I press down, I'm not going to get a different value once I reach that edge. So if I press down all the way and I move my pen around and I go over it again, it's not going to make that initial beginning of the line darker. It's going to keep that same hue unless I lift up and press on it again. So remember that as you're going through and using this tool. And then I'm going to start from the other side and do the same process where I start pressing hard on the edge. I move towards the middle and release the pen, keeping these lines parallel. Nice smooth strokes is what you want here. Okay, and if you just want to kind of add some more in there, I'm just lightly pressing down. I'm just going to go back and forth real quick. Just kind of fixing that contrast between the two colors. Very, very quick. Not too bad. You can then switch to your lighter color, say it's this avocado, and adjust some of the strokes in the middle. Okay, so I would continue this for all the other areas, making sure that I'm keeping my line angles the same. If you want to blend it a little better, just go ahead and drop the opacity of this layer. Say you want just very subtle strokes. Maybe you want a higher contrast. That's going to be up to you. Okay, while we're on the ground plane still, I'm gonna paint in my my swale here and add a little creek in it. So to do that, I don't have something that's easily selectable. This is a dashed line that I exported from Photoshop or from CAD, so I can't just use my Magic Wand tool and select that. I did forget to name this. Let's see. So what I'm gonna do is start by making a new layer. Call it swale or creek bed or whatever you'd like to call that. And I'm going to make my selection of this area. I'm not going to be able to do the whole thing. I'm just going to focus on this area up here. Zoom in to make your life easier, and then take out your polygonal lasso tool and just start making your selection here. Now, since I am using a pen, I could actually use the lasso tool and freehand draw this, but I'm so much more comfortable with this polygon tool, probably from working in CAD so much. And I'm just going to make a selection where I want to make this swale. And let's cut it off here so that we can get through this. Okay, so I know for my site, I always do a 45-degree drop shadow on my site, which means that the light is somewhere up here and it's coming down towards the lower left-hand corner of the page here. So keeping that in mind, I have a dip in the ground here, so my right side is going to have the shadow where there's no light hitting, and my left side is going to be catching that light, and so it's going to be a lot lighter. So very quickly, I can create this swale look. I'm going to use, for my warm colors palette, let's see. Let's do, yeah, dark sand and light sand once again. And just start painting. Now, I like the round watercolor brush. I'm just going to stick with that. But I'm going to up the opacity for these initial strokes here. And so I'm just going to start with the light and kind of just start filling it in. And as you would if you were, painting basically anything by hand or not digitally, you're kind of starting with these broad strokes. You're making broad shapes, just filling it in, and that's going to be kind of your base. And then once you have that base, you kind of work your way up into details. And since we don't have that much time, I'm not going to go into crazy detail on this. But my technique is that I'm switching between the light and the dark. And while my opacity is still pretty high, I can make these pretty high contrast shadows. So the swale goes under the walk here. So there's going to be a shadow there. And then there's going to be a shadow along this side here. And it's going to be darkest right up here, and it's going to blend to this lighter shade as it goes down to the bottom and comes back up. So now that I have this darker value here, I'm going to start blending it by taking the opacity down to about 33% again. And then just make these strokes overlapping each previous one and move your way down. And then switch to your light brush as well to go back if you go a little too far with the dark color. Kind of like that. Okay. And then of course the very top of here, before it kind of curves down into the swell, there's going to be some light catching there. So we have our basic swale background now. I want to add my boulders. Now these boulders are blocks. that I created. Actually, let's leave these right up here. Oops. From CAD. They are not officially in the system yet. They still need to be uploaded, but we are going to be introducing these cool kind of sketchy looking blocks for boulders shortly. And so what I want to do is just paint these real quick. So I'm going to hold down the command. Oh, sorry, not the command. I'm going to use my magic wand tool and have boulders layer activated. And I'm just going to select all the pixels on the outside with contiguous on. I'm going to select all the pixels on the outside of the boulders. And once I have that, sorry, these zoom controls are in the way. I have my pixels selected, but I have everything selected besides the boulder. So what I want to do is go to select and inverse my selection. And I want to create my base layer on the bottom of the boulders so that I'm painting underneath the line work. So I'm going to just make a layer here, base. It's in the boulders folder, so I'm not too concerned about naming it boulders base. And then I'm going to quickly use my cool grays, starting with the dark. And fill in my boulders. Once they're filled in, I can now make a new layer or just paint directly onto this layer. And I'm going to use my hard brush at about 50% opacity. And I just want to zoom in and paint some highlights on this. So the sun's coming this way, which means that this piece here is going to be lighter than this piece. Don't need smoothing on. And the top's going to be lighter there. So is this, and this, and this. That, and because I'm at 50% opacity, I can then press down again, and I have different shades of gray now, lighting up what I'm doing. So just very quickly, I can lighten up that block, give it some shadow, make it look a little bit better than it did before. And so I'll just continue that process. If you want to do it very quickly, don't zoom in all the way, and just kind of start with one layer, start again, and kind of just go a little bit lighter as you go towards your source of light. Just like that. And then because we have our solid base here, we want to add a drop shadow to that. And I like to do, like I said, 45 degrees. Distance doesn't need to be very far. Okay, now my rocks have shadows. And now we just need to create the water for the creek. So in my swale area, I'm going to create a new layer. Call it creek. And then I'm going to just select the pixels for the swale because I don't want to move outside of that with the creek water. So holding command and clicking on the preview thumb of the swale allows me to select all of these pixels here. Now I'm going to use my hard brush at 100% opacity and my water blue color. And I'm going to make my brush a little bigger. And I'm just going to kind of meander through here with my brush. I'm changing the pressure that I'm applying as I move along, so I don't get a consistent width here. But I am trying to make it smooth with what I'm doing. And so what does the creek have? It has areas that are thinner, where water's going to be moving quickly, and then there's areas where water's going to be pooling up as well. So I just want to make some areas that would be good for pooling and adding that effect. And then I could just continue down to cover the entire swale. And you could leave it like this. I mean, that is graphically looks like water, but I want to add some shadows and some highlights to it to make it a little more dynamic. So what I want to do is where it's deeper, where these pools are, I want to add shadow to give that effect. So what I'll do is I'll take my water shadow color and my brush that is soft and round, and I'll drop the opacity too. And I'll just start filling in some shadow where these pools would be. And kind of blend it in so it's not too bold a difference there. We want to have a nice gradient. You also want some shadow here where it's going to be going underneath the bridge. One thing I forgot to do is select just the creek pixels. So I'm only working within the creek. It's going to help. Add some shadow there, some shadow in this pool. And then with my water light color, repeat those steps for these shallower areas where the water is going to be moving faster through these areas, and so it's going to be more disturbed, but also it's closer to the ground, so it's just going to be lighter as it moves along here. So we have our lights and our darks for the base, and finally I just want to add some white. With my hard brush at 100% to give some shimmer, some glare, also some movement of the water. So with a small brush, I'm just going to kind of start light, add some pressure as I go into it. Just add these little bits here. As it comes up to the rock, it's going to hit it, and it's going to make these ripples. So kind of just adding this look here. Makes it feel like the water is actually flowing. And where it's deeper here, it's not going to be moving as fast. So we don't want big lines showing fast movement. We just want little bits of light here and highlights. And then as we move into our faster motion, longer strokes for the water. Okay, easy peasy. And then, of course, you can spend a lot more time on here just going into the detail of this. Okay, and once we're done, might want to actually drop the opacity of your creek so it blends in with the ground below it a little better. Okay, so that's how I achieve the water effect. Let's keep going. And close this. After ground covers, we move on to our amenities. So this is the creek after I spent a bit more time on it, but it's that same effect that I showed there. Deeper pools, water disturbance with the highlights. So we're moving on to our amenities. We have our amenities folder here. Let's turn on that layer. And I'm just going to cover the roof here. I was going to do the fountain, but it's basically the same idea as the creek, using the deeper part to be darker, lighter towards the top, and adding the white highlights as disturbance, but in a circular shape. So let's focus on this roof here. What I want to do is this time hold Command or Control and click on the thumbnail to select all the elements on the layer, make a new layer, call it Structure, and just fill it in. I'm going to be using some warm colors here. So let's start with 2 shades of my warm grays and take my brush up and just fill it in with the darker color. I always like to start with the darker color for the base and then move to lighter colors. Okay, since that is colored in, what I want to do is similar to what I was doing with the grass pattern over here. Take your lighter color, but with a hard brush at 100% opacity and make it smaller. And just make some even strokes along here. And these strokes don't have to go all the way to the end because this is this roof has an angle to it. So the lower left-hand side is actually going to be darker than this highlighted side. Now that's a bit too bright, so I'm going to switch to a different shade of my warm grays. And maybe drop the opacity down a bit so that I can really kind of blend these in. Focusing on the lighter side of this roof. Okay, now I want to cover this side and make it a bit darker to show that angle. So I'm going to take my polygonal lasso tool. I'm going to use the subtract option. I'm going to select or subtract the light side from the selection. And if you make a point like this that you don't like, you can always hit backspace and try again. So we're just going to deselect those pixels and move on to the other side of that. I want to make quite a bit darker. But starting with that same right side and moving inwards as I make my strokes. Just like that. Now our roof has that 3D look to it. What does it need still? It still needs a stroke for the outline. So I'm just going to add a stroke to it. Let's do 3 pixels, black, and then a drop shadow. With a lot more distance because it's a much taller structure. And because it has a bigger shadow, I like to add some size to it, which basically just blurs it. Okay, now we have our painted structure. And for the rest of the amenities, like this playground, it's already colored and I don't really want to do too much to it, but I will add a drop shadow that is much closer than what I had before. And then also add a filter to it. And I like to use the poster edges filter. Since these are small and such, I'm going to keep the edge thickness down and the edge intensity way down. And click OK. And it just makes it look a little less like it's a CAD file. Okay, and that does it for amenities. Let's move on to plants and wrap this up. Okay. Now with shrubs, what I want to show with shrubs is getting these areas here where it's just a bunch of circles touching each other. I want to show them more as like a massing. And so to get that effect, I'm going to do kind of what I've been doing with say the boulders, and go to my shrubs layer, use my magic wand tool, select all the pixels on the outside, change my select, or inverse my selection, and then make a base. And I'll start with just a green for this base. And I'll just fill that in. So now all of our shrubs are easily identifiable and grouped together. And so if I add an outline to this or a stroke, you're not going to get those lines in between, so it looks more like a massing. So let's do that. But first, let's actually make a copy of this layer with Control or Command J. And so this will be our base. And we will add our drop shadow and our outlines to the base. But this layer 2, call it texture, is going to be kind of all of the details and little highlights you're going to be adding to these different shrubs. So with the base, let's add a stroke. And a drop shadow. And now let's add some texture. So I'm just going to start painting on it. I want to use, let's say it's like a loropetalum or something. So it's got some kind of purple leaves going on. And I'm going to pull out my round watercolor brush again. And kind of paint my, my darker colors first. Let's take out the right tool. Okay, so we have our darker color here. It's purple. And then with that same brush, but with a lighter color, I'm going to just start kind of tapping it on there. And it's going to give you some texture for each one. And I'm just kind of tapping it, pressing hard as I tap and trying not to move around too much with each tap. And I'm just going to try to pinpoint each one, add some little highlights to it with multiple taps. And maybe I want to add some of this pink color for the very, very tip. So I'm going to take my brush size down a little bit, kind of just tap that on there. Making sure to hit that side of each round shrub that is facing the light source. So there's that for shrubs. And then instead of coloring this, I'm just going to show you how to do trees, because it's the same process as doing some of these other shrubs here. So let's move on to our trees as time is short. And I want to show a couple different tree styles. One, this is great for sort of these trees here. It's kind of a tree massing effect. Or if you're just very quickly trying to get this out the door and you want to color in some trees very quickly, we're going to once again make our selection of the pixels outside of everything. Now, unfortunately, there seems to be some breaks in the line work here, so I'm not able to just select the outside of this. So I'm going to deselect and actually make a copy of my tree layer. I'm going to add a stroke to this, and hopefully adding a stroke to this not only is going to bolden the trees here, but it's going to close up any of those little gaps that you might get when you export a PDF and then import it into Photoshop. Let's do 5 pixels so it's nice and bold so that we get those outside lines. Okay, and once again, try selecting all the pixels outside of those trees. And this time it looks like we closed all the gaps. So now we can create our tree base. And let's just make this black. Oops. Of course, before you do that, you should inverse your selection. And then make your base. So now all my trees are black, which is going to be handy in a little bit, but not immediately. So let's now keep the selection and say we just want to paint these trees real quick. These ones here. Let's take out our greens. And this is how I would have done a lot of these other shrubs as well, because there doesn't have to be as much detail in the shrubs. It'd be nice to just very kind of quickly touch those up and give them some paint flavor. So I'm going to take out my hard brush, make it real big, at 100% opacity, and I'm just going to paint this base coat here. And then I'm going to take out my lighter color. These are actually going to be kind of a olive color. And then I'm just going to drop my opacity down to, once again, 33% or thereabouts, because it's just a really nice opacity to be working with. And I'm just going to kind of quickly go over these and add some highlight. And I'm lifting up about 2 to 3 times per tree, just getting a couple of different shades in there with my highlight color. And again, this is just a very, very quick way to color these trees. So I'm kind of starting with a circle around, and then as I move up, kind of change that highlight area towards the light source. And then you kind of just go back through and just add some more highlight, fix it up a little bit. I am moving probably a little faster than I should be. And then it's nice to kind of go back with that dark color again and get those edges. Just very quickly, back to our forest green. And just kind of hit up these edges with a small brush. Because there's still going to be shadow towards the bottom of the foliage. It doesn't just need to fall on one side. But it should be more, there should be more shadow on the side facing away from the light source. So that's just a very, very quick method to get some color on these trees and then send it out. Next style I want to show is an accent tree with a lot of color. And it's going to be these circles here that look like Mickey Mouse ears. And so what I want to do is I want to find one that's isolated or pull one to the side and work on that. And I'm going to copy that around. But let's just work on this guy since he's already here and isolated. So I'm going to make a layer for it. just going to call it red maple. And again, take out my colors I'm going to use, starting with a darker color and moving towards the light. So it's going to start with this red, and it's going to move up to this orange color. And I'm just going to fill it in with the red to start off with. And then there's a couple different brushes you can use here, but I like to use, I think it's this guy, yeah, the round curve low bristle percent brush to add some texture to it. So now I'm going to move up to my second tone or hue, I guess, of this kind of red-orange color scheme I'm going to be using. Zoom in and make your brush size small and just kind of tap it around without dragging too much, because you want to get that kind of stipple look here, and just add some texture. Don't go too crazy with it. Move on to your next color and work your way up to the lighter side, and then at the very end throw some yellow in there just a little bit on that side. And it's going to look nice. Maybe come back with your darker color once again and take away some of that highlight value. The more you do this, the more it kind of cuts down on the perfect circles that you're drawing. And again, it's kind of those imperfections that make this look a little more hand rendered. And there you go. You've got a nice tree there. You can go in with some other brushes and add some little texture if you want, but I'm just going to stick with this. And so now what I do is I have this red maple layer. It's this guy. I want to make copies of that and place it on all the other instances of the red maple. So Command J makes me a red maple copy. V key to move, and I'm just going to drag this over and use my arrow keys to finally fine-tune where that placement is. Yep. Place them right there. And press Enter and Control J again. Makes another copy. I can just keep going from there. If you find that they're looking a little too similar, you can, once they're all placed, go back and select them all and actually merge the layers together. So you're working with one layer for these plants, and go back and add some extra strokes at like a 30%. And if you do that, you'll be basically creating unique patterns for each one. So it kind of cuts down on time. Basically, you can apply this process that's very quick to this, which is a little more detailed, but make them not look totally the same. Alternatively, you can just rotate them ever so slightly as you place each layer. All right, so I've done that. And then the final tree type that I want to show is one that you'll see a lot in hand-rendered plans that have a understory. You want a tree that, graphically it's a tree, but you also kind of want to see what's going on underneath it. So that's kind of reserved for these larger trees that have a big canopy. And so what I want to do is actually select this guy and work with him. Going back to that layer where I can easily select my trees. I'm going to just select this guy. And I'm actually going to turn this off, this layer, these layers off. So I'm just working with this. And what I want is a darker edge that kind of fades into a translucence. And so I'm going to take out a green tone. I'm going to use this dark green. And make a new layer. And I think we still have this brush that I want to use out. Yeah, this guy's really good for this technique here. But what I'm doing is I'm just going to kind of drag around the edges, do some dots, but also kind of just pull it in around the edges. Also, once I get my kind of outline I'm going to come in and drop the opacity. And I'm going to come in and continue this sort of tap and drag. So I get this like kind of gradient of like solid green, and it fades out towards the middle. Going around like that. Give it some taps. Okay, and then if you go a little too far, you can take out your eraser tool using the same brush type. And kind of just adjust how far out that green comes. And then of course you want to add some flair to it, so you want to do a little highlight. Add a little highlight here, go around with the lighter green. Maybe a little more on this side. And then also a little accent. And I want to use like a violet color. And using the same brush, just kind of tap it around. Don't go too crazy with it. Just add some nice little accent to it. So now, if you were to copy this layer, and drag it around, and place it over the other ones, you now have that nice kind of see-through tree style. The problem with these though is that if you add a drop shadow to this, the drop shadow is going to kind of fall in the middle. It's going to look weird because there's pixels that aren't there. So that's why we keep this layer around, because this can become our drop shadow. So to do that, make a copy of this layer. So we have two of the same layer. We want to then take the bottom version and move it Did I do that right? I did not. Make a copy of the correct layer, then move the bottom one down and to the left or wherever your shadow falls. And that previous layer or the other layer that is still in position of where this was, do a command select and then hit delete. And that's going to delete all the pixels that the trees are actually on. So now we have these nice shadows that don't impede on the see-through tree symbols. And we could drop our opacity down to wherever you like your shadows. And if they're too hard, go ahead and add a little bit of a blur to it. And yeah, so for these trees, I basically did the same thing as I did for this, except I filled them in all the way, and then I just used my eraser to kind of remove some of the middle so you could see that round planter that the tree sits in. But that's pretty much all the techniques that I have pulled in order to achieve this drawing. However, this took about 3 hours, maybe. So, you know, that's about the time that I think it would take to do a kind of a simple plan like this. But still pretty fast, especially compared to conventional hand drawing methods. So before we get to our raffle, I will address any questions if there are any.
We definitely got a good number of questions, and we'll try to go get these quick so we can get to the raffle. Basically, a lot of people were just kind of curious on when you're using the tablet as opposed to the mouse on the computer. So if you could kind of,
I was using the mouse, or not the mouse, the tablet the whole time.
Okay, well, see, that answers that.
Yeah, once I switched to Photoshop, I because I'm on a screen, I was basically just using that. What I was doing though is for a lot of my quick commands, I was going to my keyboard and or using my quick buttons on the tablet itself. But the tablet, I mean, so I'm using the tablet now. When you hover, at least with this model, about an inch away from the screen, it'll move the mouse around. So it'll track your mouse, and then when you actually touch down, it's going to make that click. So I can actually access all of my menus and everything with the pen tool and tablet without having to go back to my mouse. Certainly, a hybrid of both is warranted. Some things are better with the mouse, I think, like hitting menus, because even though it's pretty accurate to where my pen point touches the tablet, sometimes it's just kind of hard to get some of these smaller buttons. Like this one, I'll have to tap a few times, and so sometimes it's just better to just grab your mouse and use that.
Very cool. And then just one more quick question before we can get to this raffle. A couple of people did ask about the brushes, and I think just the better answer is maybe when we get this this webinar recording posted, we'll kind of include some of the brushes that you were using by name, but I don't know if you want to really quickly address kind of which were some of your favorites in brushes.
Yeah, so I believe that all the brushes I use come with Photoshop. I do have brushes that I've downloaded, and they're fun, but the ones that I stuck to for this, I believe they're all sort of the vanilla brushes. And that's why they're so close to the top. But my favorite ones, I mean, so when I'm doing line work or solid colors and such, this hard round pressure brush is just great. It just, you can touch lightly and make these really kind of smooth lines with different varying widths. It's like using an actual brush pen, which is pretty nice. And then for blending two colors, I found that the soft brushes work really well. If you use this and you drop the opacity down, and you use the colors that you're using to blend, say a dark green and a light green, getting those together to blend smoothly using the soft brush works really well. And then I use that bristle brush to make some of those dotted spots, but I really like the round watercolor and the salted watercolor. I really, this round watercolor is just, it gives you like a nice texture that looks very watercolor-like. But what's cool is if you drop the opacity and you go over it, it just, I don't know, it just blends together really well. And the same goes for that salted watercolor brush. It seems to be dynamic to where the more you go over it, the more it kind of, the paint actually seems to change on the paper, and acting kind of like how a watercolor would, or at least as close to a real watercolor as I've seen in digital format. So yeah, so it's the salted watercolor, the rounded watercolor, the hard brush, and the soft brush are my basic four that I use for just about everything.
Well, great. And a reminder too, with that, the files that you've been using in the color library are going to be available with this recorded webinar. But I think it is time to get this switched over and raffle off one of these tablets to a lucky attendee.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for attending today's webinar. We are excited to give away the same Gaiuman drawing tablet that Paul used in his presentation today. Please make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter. There you'll get updates on any future webinars and also about future giveaways that we'll have. Remember that we do these presentations every Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So if you have any questions about it, and you missed out on it, you can always rewatch it because we'll post it on our website later. Now I'm going to go ahead and draw the winner.
How many people are in the hat?
We have 180 attendees that I get to draw from today. So, and yes, we're using a very fun space hat. Okay, and the winner is Chris Lazarick. So you will be getting the tablet today. Congratulations, and we'll be contacting you this afternoon to get your shipping information for the tablet. Woo!
Yay, congratulations, Chris. We did it.
You're still on the screen.
All right, well, I guess that's going to conclude our webinar for the day. I hope you all enjoyed. And if you have any questions, go ahead and send me an email. It's just paul@landeffects.com. And have yourselves a wonderful weekend.